This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.
Hi everybody, it's John Holl with you this week, and I'm coming to you from Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I'm here for the winter conference of the Michigan Brewers Guild. And I could have come up with a fancy introduction of my guest today, but in doing my research on him, I found this quote which sums it up perfectly. Fred is craft. He has made craft beer and spirits his livelihood. He is committed to craft food movement, hosting dinners, developing his own cooking prowess. Hell, he wrote a book about it. And if you've had the pleasure of visiting his and his wife's farm, you know that this is not just a hobby for him. Craft is the way that Fred lives his life. And that's Brett Vanderkamp, the president and co-founder of New Holland Brewing, where my guest today, Fred Bueltmann, used to work for a while, and he's since gone. He is the beer evangelist, as he is known. You are Michigan beer. You are Mr. Craft.
Well, thank you.
Those are Brett's words, so it's.
Yeah.
But I was excited to read them.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm flattered by it, and it's also something that I'm really grateful for, because I spent really more than I think 25 or 26 years in the beer industry, and along the way, it's I think what I love to share about beer and what I hoped beer was doing for the world is also what happened to me, which is it inspired me to take a closer look at everything and kind of care more deeply and just pay attention. And so it brought me to food and to looking at that in a more inspired perspective, and it brought me to look around the world and think differently. So as much as it's flattering to hear it said about me, it's also what I'm grateful for that the industry has given me and inspired me with.
So the word craft, and we've had this conversation on previous shows. You did a podcast in the past. You've done two podcasts, actually, and we'll talk about the second one in a minute. You've been on the other podcast that I do called Steal This Beer. We've talked about the word craft a lot over the years, the two of us, and I feel that during that time, and certainly the 15 or so years that I've been in the industry, the longer you've been in the industry, that word has morphed to mean one thing at one point and means something else now. And I think it used to mean, and we knew what it meant, like artisanal and small batch, and now Dunkin' Donuts has craft bagels for sale in the morning, which is really anything but. With you tied up so much in this industry, and not just beer, but spirits and food and everything else, what is the current state of craft?
Well, I think personally, I still think it means what it means to me and to a lot of consumers. That's why some of these other producers and brands are using it. Is that if it didn't mean something valuable and wholesome, they wouldn't be attaching it to their products that may not represent that otherwise. So
yeah.
I think even though it's a little wobbly at times as a buzzword and as a definitive mark, I think even in those sort of manipulated moments, they're using it because it represents something customers kind of know and reflect on, which is like, oh, I get it. This is probably, independent, farm to table, made traditionally. There's something of this that is more wholesome or grounded than its other alternative.
Sure.
And so I do think it's getting warped, but and that's a risk so this project that I've started, this Craft Nation, I'm using craft in the name, knowing that it can be polarizing, but I think it still has a lot of life. And any word we describe something, once it becomes valuable enough for other people to try to just use it for its value, it changes. I mean, we've seen this with lots of different terms, and sometimes the when you see it is more powerful than trying to make things absolutely black and white. And one parallel is like organic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So organic does have some specific scientific connotations about what it means to be of organic nature. But I think in its outset, it also meant something about the farm you expected it to be from and the practices they used, and it had some other connotations to it. Now, organic, isn't the strongest word because there's a lot of big farms doing organic, and the government requirements to be certified organic are so rigorous and challenging that some of the small farms that might be doing better practices than a really large one that's labeled organic, you know it when you see it. The customers of those small farms, they aren't worried about the certification. I know farmers that have offhand used the terms, and it means something to chefs, saying, "Oh, we're more than organic."
Okay.
Like, don't look for it on the label. I don't have the certificate. Come out to my farm. I'll show you.
But doesn't it delude when there are places like, Wawa, the convenience store, having craft sandwiches, that you get from the counter that you can get, that just aren't. Again, like they might not taste bad, but it does convey a certain thing. So then when you get it, I'm just wondering, when people are using this word.
Oh, I'm with you.
Yeah.
And I'm frustrated by it, but I think it's part of the natural course of popularity that we've made something collectively. The people across this country made things of value that term meant so much that it became attractive enough to be used in that way. And what I'm saying is that an established customer of our segment, right? So let's say a craft beer consumer, if they see somebody misusing it, the customers who know better, and they may be irritated. They may be like, "Oh, yeah, there's Kraft and Dunkin' Donuts now." They eye roll. They still don't think, "Oh, well, Dunkin' Donuts equals Kraft now." Now, a consumer who's not in our
That's
camp
what I was going to ask. Yeah.
will be confused, and that's where the lack of transparency. This ends up being, I think, a battle over transparency. And to me, it's not about the definition of the word craft, although in certain camps that's important for people to focus on. I'm kind of going more to the root of it and saying, okay, transparency is really what's important. That if you're a customer that starts to value where your things come from and how they're made, and you want to be with truthful, trustworthy makers, you want to have this personal connection, then you ask questions about, well, so what do you mean by this craft sandwich Dunkin' Donuts? Well, and if the answers don't jive, you're like, yeah, okay, that's what I thought.
Right.
And on the other hand, whether somebody uses the word craft or not, when you're in a place that says, whatever, if it's in the food comparison, like this has been happening as long as they've had farm to table. There's restaurants who know the farmers and have a really rigorous program, and their food shows it, their ethos show through their whole experience. And then there's other people, the old term greenwashing, where they buy, a pound of lettuce from the organic farm, the farmer's market, and 100 pounds from the big food distributor, and they're farm to table.
Right.
And I just think that generally the customers that are going to be the most valuable to this movement, I count on their intelligence to sniff the difference out. And I also then call makers to say transparency is what's important right now. And customers, if you can't figure out the path that this, if you can't sort of feel and see and trust that it is what they say it is, then buyer beware. It's mindfulness that's still going to make the difference, meaning whether the term gets misused or used appropriately, this idea of what it is craft represents prior to that bastardization of sorts, that idea is still valuable, whatever we call it. If we end up calling it a new term down the road, so be it, or whatever. But what we know is that something that, something that is trustworthy and made with great intention and made where quality is prioritized above convenience and price, that's something that we didn't have in our marketplace for a number of decades. We had it before and we're getting it now. But that got traded away for the sake of convenience, for the sake of national markets. And this is not just beer, not just spirits, not even, it's across widely in food and drink, but it's everything. Is that we as a nation grew to a certain time where commoditization and industrialization and mass production, these were ideas with, I think, good intentions in most cases, but they stripped us of choice and and quality took a backseat to convenience, and it took us a while to recognize what we lost. And I think the power of all this is we're getting it back. So I guess what I'm saying is I lean a lot more towards what are we talking about rather than what are we calling it.
Okay.
I think that's a priority. Cause
No, I think
call it whatever. Like every industry, I talk to makers of all different types, and big, little, successful, marginal, new, old. And it's like, I would use the word craft and people got what I meant. It doesn't mean their industry is like, we're a craft blacksmith. They're just a blacksmith or bootmaker or guitar maker. Like, they weren't using the word craft, but they knew why I was talking to them under this umbrella of craft, because we got it. It was a language piece rather than a label piece.
So in 2017, you embarked on a new journey for this. It's going to be a book.
Yes.
It's a podcast as well, and it's this project that you're calling This Craft Nation.
Correct.
Tell us about it.
Well, in short, I wanted to talk about what we're talking about. I wanted to talk about the craft renaissance that I've been fortunate to be a part of through beer and spirits, and in some indirect ways food as well. And I felt like what I've experienced, and the more I got to speak to people and following writing the Beer Evangelist Guide to the Galaxy.
Which was your first cookbook.
Yeah, first
and
book.
I want to talk to you about that as well.
That was a book on beer and food, and there was a bit of philosophy in there about seasonal eating and connecting to what you eat and drink. Pardon me. So as I started thinking about the next book, instead of this, I kind of had another food book lined up, and I just felt myself drawn this other way, and I was like, I really want to talk about this bigger thing, this cultural shift that we're going through, and like even these questions we're asking, what is it? What is the importance of the word? What makes something different? Why have people responded, internationally in such a way where we're paying more for products, we're working harder to find them, we're adding inconvenience to our lives to make several stops to different stores for different products, or go to the specialty store, or wait for something. We're willing to pay more for stuff. Why? Why is that happening in bread and cheese and coffee and wood and clothing? And instead of looking at that, when you're in a segment like I was in beer and then spirits down the road, you can look at it as a sales trend, as this branding and marketing success of your segment, and it's because we're doing such great things. And I'd love to, for us to be able to take credit, but when I look at it and I say, well, this is happening in all of these other areas too, it's this idea that there's something in common with all these things that's more about the consumer. And so what I did, so I knew that was the idea of what I wanted to write about, and then my next thought was, I don't want to try to write this as a lecture or as Fred's opinion solely, and so I have really gotten in touch with the power of story and people. And so I thought, well, what if I could talk to a bunch of different makers, a bunch of people that are part of this movement that are in areas that I don't know anything about. So instead of going in and talking to a bunch of brewers or distillers or chefs, what if I talk to people where I'm, less informed and more curious, and I count on the power of curiosity and the power of story. And if I could tell the story of several makers and their experience over the last couple of decades, again, diverse in what they do and diverse in who they are. So some of them have been doing it for a few years, some have been doing it for decades. Maybe that would paint a picture of our country and what has transformed over the last 30 to 50 years in a more powerful way, in a more engaging way than just trying to list what I think I know about it. And so in April, I was still working for New Holland, and we created a sabbatical program that I was fortunate to participate in, where I took.
Did you create it just for yourself?
No, I was a voice in helping it get created, but for a long time I didn't know how I'd ever find a clearing in the calendar, and I did, and so a friend of mine, illustrator and photographer, friend of mine, Kyle Bice, who I've done some other creative projects with, he and I had been talking about this for a while, and we set out and we circled the country in 35 days, mostly on the train. We drove like 4 or 5 legs, and we traveled about 9,000 miles, and we interviewed more than 50 people and talked to them about what they did, why they did it, who they sold to, how has it changed, what are the customers like, what are the strengths, what are the threats, and just really even less specific stuff, just like, I mean, you know how it goes. I love the conversational aspect of learning, which is like you start talking in their shop and the life unfolds. And so we talked, we listened, shared some beers, and we got a really powerful sort of mosaic of what's going on. And so right now I'm in the process of going through all that, and we're broadcasting some of those interviews as podcast episodes, and sometimes it's conversations amongst our small team, while I'm at home on the farm trying to distill all this information down and write the book, which will basically tell the story of our trip, and then take some sidebar trips into what are the themes that tie all these completely different people that don't know each other. There's some really strong themes that help, I think, point to what it is that we are recovering from as a culture, and what are we striving for, and what do we value.
When you say what we're recovering from as a culture, I explore that just for a minute, because I think I know what you mean, but I want to.
Well, probably the most powerful picture I can paint is back to the food world, but I find that every industry has this story. It may have taken place at a different time and looked a little differently, but the most powerful imagery I can think of is that it was once really normal for us as adolescents to know what season foods grew in, and we knew the butcher and the baker and the barber, and we just had a more natural, ready awareness of where our things came from, and the advancement, and there were advancements. So it's like, I'm not filled with anger about it, but the advancement of the modern marketplace and the modern grocery store and refrigeration and shipping meant that food came from sealed bags in a well-lit grocery store.
Yeah.
And we didn't know when asparagus season was anymore. I didn't grow up knowing it.
Right.
And so that happened over the course of a few generations. And that ends up also being not only like an insulation from the natural growth of things, the natural like order.
Yeah.
It's not only an insulation, but it ultimately removing choice. So now the grocer is choosing which farm is represented. Maybe they're not. They're just buying it from a centralized warehouse where asparagus is now asparagus. But our choices were getting farther and farther away from us, where if you wanted to have a discussion about quality and which asparagus you wanted,
you can't have that
was no longer
Yeah.
presented as an option. And now enter the farmers market, and food buying clubs in like the 70s, and the growth of that has been dramatic through the 80s and 90s. And now you can walk the aisle and you can say, I like Charlie's corn, but have you seen Brenda's greens or whatever?
Sure.
Like, you can have this personal preference for quality of produce, for your soft spot of liking the people or the farm or their practice. You can go ask them, so, do you spray, and if so, what with? And that was, so information and choice, those went away. And the food story is powerful and visible, and we all had that experience because we all ate through our childhood to survive. But I look at every industry and like that, everybody went through some period of industrialization and commoditization where the small producer trying to sell on quality, when that choice of quality is taken out of the marketplace, their value is gone. Mm-hmm. The customer doesn't have access to that.
And it loses its specialness as well. Looking forward to something is not really something that we experience
Right.
anymore. In Jersey, where I am, the best tomato state in the country, hands down. I won't eat tomatoes now outside of tomato season, and it's. At first blush, people are like, well, that's crazy. It's like, no, the tomatoes I get in January are wet pink cardboard.
Right.
I don't want them.
The tomatoes you eat in January ought to come from the jars in your cupboard that you put up in September.
Yeah, well, it's, not all of us live on the farm where we can do that.
No,
but I get
what
your
I'm saying
point,
is,
though.
Tomatoes change.
But
like fresh tomatoes is different than, there are different purposes for. I'm agreeing.
No,
with
no,
you,
no.
just relating, my tomatoes shift in terms of there are ways to eat them in the winter. It's not a fresh slice.
But what about the people who? Because I even feel like craft beer and the beer industry these days, that there are the people who care, and then there's a larger group of people who don't care. It's just it's whatever. I'm going to have whatever, or I'll have my tomato in January. Thanks very much. I'm not stopping and thinking about it. And you did this when you were at New Holland. You did a program, Stop and Taste.
Yeah.
And that really struck with me because I don't think we stop enough these days. I count myself in that with cell phones and work and family and people being thrown in 1,000 different directions. We don't often actually stop to consider what it is that we're eating, what it is that we're drinking, or even what it is that we're buying. And I know that on this trip that you were out, you were talking to furniture makers and blacksmiths and people who actually still craft things from hands. And people go to IKEA on the weekends now and they buy the same couch that 50 other people are going to walk out with. That day, and they're not necessarily stopping and thinking, is this either economical? Is this the best thing? Is the ramifications? Is there anything that you've been able to, in your life, put into practice to help you stop, to help you not get caught up in the busyness of just everyday life in 2018?
Yeah, well, so in 2000 I moved to Michigan from Chicago, and I had already been with Bell's Brewing for 5 years, and I would be with them another 5 or 4.5, something like that. But when I moved to Michigan from Chicago, I'd already been inspired by chefs and food and beer and food. But when I moved to the country in a small town, I got a farm with a horse, bought a house that came with a horse. And
you didn't grow up that way, did you?
I grew up in the sticks a little bit. My grandparents had a farm that I'd visit once a year, but I didn't grow up with that as I wasn't out doing farm chores in the morning. Okay. But I lived where I drove by farms, and
Sure.
The neighbor across the street had horses, so I had adjacency to it. But I was a suburban kid, and then went to the city and loved the hustle and bustle of the city, and was very project and career minded in different ways, and I was definitely a sped up city boy when I got to Michigan. But I'd already been coming into Michigan quite a bit, and so I'd started to grasp that it was a different pace, and I liked it. And then when I moved to a farmhouse, and I wasn't really raising anything other than a horse, which became horses, but I wasn't growing things. But I was now in that community, and I did get a taste for a different pace and a different lifestyle. And now I'm on a farm in Fenville with more acreage, and we're doing hay for the horses, and we've done some other things, and I'm more entrenched and have incorporated a lot of the homestead lifestyles, what I call it, where you're either growing or you're putting food up. You're living in a style of providing for your homestead, through your own sort of resources and know-how. So that is, it can sound like a lot of work on one hand. On the other hand, it's work that grounds you. It's work that makes you forget about the office. And because, they say to clear the mind, you got to dirty the hands. Mm-hmm. I've repeated that millions of times. I don't know who said it originally, but it's like when I'm doing that sort of work, I love it because some of the other stressors and fast-paced pressure that our current workplace and our current appetite for information creates slows down a little bit. And, listen to some music and can tomatoes for a few hours and see how you feel afterwards. It's you feel good, and so that has helped. But I think I want to turn this a little bit for a second, because I'm going to go back to where you were headed earlier, and it relates to this, in that what I think is important is that I also don't want, I think part of what I'm trying to do with my outreach and with why I want to tell stories as a way to draw people in is that I want to keep this inviting, and I don't want people to think they have to be a specialist or they have to completely nerd out on something to enjoy it. Because, like, being relaxed about something but surrounding yourself with quality choices is, or not, is also a choice. Like, I think the choice to, like, say, I'll have a beer, whatever, bring me something, surprise me.
Yeah.
I know if I do that in my circles, I'm probably going to have a good beer. Like, I don't have to...
You don't have to
You don't have to wrestle this thing down and be finicky and hard to please, or we just don't have to... We don't have to turn this into a competition of specialness or rarity or... part of the mission for creating the Stop and Taste campaign was that we want this to be easy, and all of these choices and these products were made for people to enjoy, because we found ourselves in a world where there were less enjoyable things. And so to me, remembering that purpose is like, listen, we're not doing this to be praised as the greatest creators of beer or widgets or whatever. We're doing this so people have enjoyable things in their lives. So let's take a minute and enjoy it. And that's not always analysis. It's not always being, hypercritical. Like, it's the simple things that bring joy. But if we have more quality around us, it's easier to be simple.
You bring up something interesting. When you said critical, we don't have to be critical. I think that, again, going back to where we are these days, and with sites like Yelp and Untapped, and everybody has a voice. And sometimes people are unnecessarily cruel because of the anonymity of the internet. And sometimes people, when they're posting just for the sake of posting, forget that there is somebody else on the other end. When you were traveling around for this book project and you were talking to people not just in beer, did you touch on that? Did you talk to people about the criticism about when somebody cuts into their love, their passion, and what that does for the psyche? I mean, I often wonder if some people don't follow a passion because they're worried about what other people say.
Off the top of my head, I can't think of an instance where that happened. People did talk about, hey, so you go from making it for yourself and you decide, there are people that opened Etsy shops and as their way to start the business, or restaurants that, they did talk about you have to be your own judge, that you have to kind of steel yourself, and while you have to kind of know that input's coming in out there, that can't be your barometer for what you do. Like, there was a lot of one of the themes is just talking about how personal this is for people in all these different segments, and that we do it this way because it's the way we believe it should be done. So I think we bumped up against some of that stuff a little bit, but I don't know there was an example of anybody saying I almost didn't do it, or but I think it delivers pain at times, probably more than anything else. I know that they can be a tool for searching, for finding places, and so in some ways I'll go back to what I remember saying in their really early days when it was coming into beer with Beer Advocate and then Rate Beer. I'm glad there's a community talking about beer and valuing this, but I have a hard time logging in and reading this stuff.
Yeah.
And I kind of still go with that. I think the communities talking about things have brought forward, people trying new restaurants and trying new products, and I love that there's online resources for things. I'm a sousaphone player, and there's not a sousaphone, but there's a tuba. This
is radio, so people can't always picture. I'm not even sure I can conjure in my mind what a sousaphone is.
Sousaphone is a tuba that wraps around you, so it's the old marching tubas.
Okay.
There are purists, as I know from the tuba discussion forum I'm on, that say, no, it's not a tuba that's wrapped around, it's its own instrument. But it's in the family, and it's essentially a marching tuba. But my point is, there's a discussion forum. It's not like a rating site, but where people who are passionate about this stuff post and are resources for each other, and you can find parts and instruments and people, and it's incredible. And I think that every walk of life has now, there's a conversation happening online that is going to include networking and advice and mentoring, and it's probably going to include some hostility and criticism and what the anonymity of the web brings. But I think most people can figure that out. I don't know, I'm off on a tangent. Other than that, I think it's good. But I remember writing about it in Beer Evangelist Guide that I also think people need, what I hope is that we can mature as a culture to realize that when we hit the return button, we're writers. And I wish that we would be more mindful in what we did with our words online as humans.
And that goes to the stop and taste, or
just whether you're
stop.
Professional or not.
You're right. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's Yelp reviews that are finished before they're done with their meal.
Yeah.
And it's like we need the stop and taste was about enjoy the experience, set things down, turn things off.
Is that still online? Do you know?
It is not online.
That's too bad, because
it may go back up. I have all the episodes. I'm not sure where that'll go.
Okay, because that's one of those things that I think people should go and back and just...
Yeah, I mean, the Stop and Taste campaign is alive and well, but my particular podcast episodes are not currently on the server.
Well, if that goes back up, but also go to the New Holland site and look at the Stop and Taste campaign, which I thought came out, in 2014?
That sounds about right.
14, 15. It was really one of the better, if not the best, craft brewery marketing campaign of that year. And it really got people thinking. I remember seeing it at GABF, Great American Beer Festival, and people were actually stopping and reading the words and really taking it all in. And I think that it helped people connect with beer better, but certainly your brand, which is what you wanted it to be, but beer as a whole.
And overall, that's prioritizing experience. And we got to this point by you saying you don't always have to be critical. And I just think, with people on apps and wanting to log all their beer adventures and every beer they had, I'm like, so there's some of that can be really good, like journaling is really good.
Yeah.
But we know what it's like to judge beer professionally. And when you're in a judge's table, you're there to find flaws and to also find the exceptional beers at the table. And so it is our job, like it's a mechanic's job, to diagnose a car that's not running properly, to be critical, to find the error. That to me is not the most pleasant part about drinking beer.
No.
That's hard work.
No, yeah.
Right? And it will take away your pleasure for a minute.
Right. And you get that from people where they're like, judging beer.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah.
And I'm proud that, that there are professionals that can do that really well, and I'm proud to be in that company. But I want people to be able to set that aside and be like, all the sort of, the regular drinkers that are rating beer, I kind of look at that's the least enjoyable part of beer.
Talk to your date. Talk to your buddy.
Go to the bar and have a couple
meet
beers.
Meet a friend.
The phrase that I've come to is that.
By the way, pretty much everybody listening has now just turned off in disgust because that's.
Oh, this rant again. So I'll sum it up, and then we can move to the next point. I'll sum it up is that I like to talk shit over beers. I don't like to talk a shit about beers over beers.
Okay. That's a good philosophy.
Talk shit instead of talking shit about the beer. That's what beer's there for, so you can talk shit about something else.
That's probably a pull quote for this episode. You mentioned the Beer Evangelist Guide, your book that came out a couple years ago, and we're here at the Michigan Brewers Guild Winter Conference in Kalamazoo, and tomorrow you're working on a dinner for 500 people, which
yes.
I can't imagine that there's too many people who are listening to this right now have ever had a similar experience. So I want to briefly just ask, in a very brief way, what's that like?
Well, thankfully, I helped create this dinner with the Radisson Hotel back in, I think, what would have been January of 2010. And so they've been through this a few times, and they do the heavy lifting in terms of the cooking and logistics, and they are pros. And so kudos to John, Jake, Jesse, and Lindsay who make all that happen and their crews. But what we did was I was really frustrated, having been the president of the guild for a long time. That wasn't what I was frustrated with, but to be blunt, we were failing at our dinner at our conference because it was the last thing to be planned. We were all volunteer board. Our conference had grown to be a few hundred people, but I was just a regular beer dinner for that type of group and that number of group, and with the amount of planning we were putting forward to it, wasn't working. And so when I stepped down as president, I was like, we need something different. And long story short, instead of trying to do a course dinner, which with that number of people and the attention span of brewers and the number of beers we have available to us, is like, we're trying to limit this to like 6 beers. We're trying to get brewers to sit still for an hour and a half. These are losing propositions. So what we've done is we've organized the room. We just changed it a little bit this year, but there's essentially 4 flavor-based stations and then 2 other stations. And the flavor-based stations is built around how I built Beer Evangelist Guide, which I started teaching beer through families of flavor instead of styles first. So there's a malt forward table, and there's 3 courses there, 2 beers paired with each dish. But if you want 1 beer, it'll go with pretty much any one of those dishes. I've tailored it specifically, but loosely at the same time, because these are all the flavor families that are going to go along well with any of those beers. So if you want to nerd out and try every pairing, it's set up for you to be able to do that. And it's browsing so that you can walk around. You can go to whatever station you want to at any time. So people don't have to sit still. They can socialize and hang out. And if you want to just get a beer and put some food on your plate and continue your conversation, you can do that too. So you don't have to be a fan of the process to have a good time and have good food and drink in your hands. And so we have a hop forward station. We have From the Cellar, which is fermentation forward beers like Belgians and Hefes, etc. And then the 4th is, I call it wood aged in fruit, but it's like the freestyle, where you start bringing in ingredients like wood or fruit or spices or things beyond traditional beer ingredients. That's the freestyle table. And then this year we moved dessert off the flavor tables. So we have a 5th table that's dessert. And then there's a dessert paired with each flavor family.
Okay.
And then the 6th is just grazing, an unpaired station with salads and cheeses. So it really allowed us to put some logistics in the hotel's hands, where they can do a lot of smaller kind of walking style dishes. They can have hot boxes and chefs behind tables instead of trying to plate this at the time it was like 250 people, and it's now grown to 500. So, and I sit down with the hotel staff and we create a menu based on these flavor families, and then I go through, and this year, the last 2 years, I think, I know this year specifically, there isn't one brewery repeated on the pairing. So we have 32 paired beers and then a casual draft bar that's unpaired.
That's a testament to how much Michigan beer has grown.
Yeah, and I wasn't even hard pressed. It was like I have 38 breweries represented. 32 of them are paired with 16 dishes.
So you've used the word pairing a few times, and as I start looking at the clock for this episode, I think that there is a lot of misinformation when it comes to pairing beer with food, and I think that there's also just a lot of uncertainty that people have because they feel like there's this enormous pressure to get it right. You know, it has to be 1,000%. It has to be this epic high five every time whatever you have on your plate matches whatever's in your glass. And you don't subscribe to that philosophy. And so I wonder when somebody says to you, oh, how do you pair beer and food, which is such a wide open question. But is there one or two things that all of us can carry around and remember without stressing ourselves out?
Yeah, I'll do my best to both help and also to keep it brief, which I'm not very good at. But, the first thing I want to do is encourage people to have confidence in that, mindfulness is your biggest tool, like thinking about it, pausing for a minute and thinking, we're going for harmony. We're going for things that go well together one way or another. There's all sorts of different ways to do that, and that's where the tips and the guides and learning more specifics will help you. But essentially, the purpose is that we're looking for things that bring us pleasure when they come together and that change the experience. I talk about pairing being the expectation of change, that we're not just eating something good next to drinking something good. We're hoping that they're coming together changes the experience for us. And one way I try to encourage people to think for themselves about this is that, if you have an opinion on peanut butter and jelly, like, do you love it, do you hate it, are you indifferent?
We'll cut the crust first, obviously, but yeah.
Well, okay, so those are two different flavors that were brought together for harmony that you have an opinion of. You've been pairing since you were a little kid.
Yeah.
Because you either said, yes, I want another one, or, oh, that's terrible. That instinct we have in us. Our palate, our tongue talks to our brain all the time. We have all the tools. So now you're just in the last one for today that I'll add is, so there's this mindfulness and harmony. Then there's like permission to trust yourself that you're a tasting expert. You've been doing it all your life. And then there's this idea that if you look flavor first instead of technique or style, you don't have to be an expert to say, oh, this tastes like grapefruit, this tastes like chocolate, this tastes like caramel, this tastes like fruit. What do I like with those things? I've had chocolate before. What do I like with chocolate? Would I like it next to vanilla ice cream? Oh, so a beer that you don't have to know if it's a porter or a stout or a brown ale, but if it has chocolatey notes and you wonder whether it'll pair well with your apple pie a la mode, you have the tools to try it and to say, I think this would go well here. So I think people have more power and more awareness than they know, and the quickest way for any of us, including me or you or other experts, to diminish our creative juices is to clamp down on everything and be like, I hope I get this right. I better not screw it up.
Right.
That's when we'll start ideas get locked away in boxes. And so there are ways you can get better at your vocabulary, or get better at thinking about the number of choices you have, and get a little more reliable suggestions in terms of things to try, just like looking through recipes to cook. Mm-hmm. But the best cooks start to go on their instinct, and you can inform your instincts. But I'm saying everybody that has a tongue, working, awake brain, has the ability to pair mindfully.
All right, I like it.
Thanks.
That's I think that's a good place to leave.
Yeah, and flavor first. What is it? Ask yourself what it tastes like, rather than trying to be correct about what you think it's supposed to taste like.
That's good advice. Fred Bueltmann is the author of the forthcoming book, This Craft Nation, which you can find online at thiscraftnation.com. They're also on Twitter at the same thing, at thiscraftnation. And his podcast you can find under the tinyurl.com/thiscraftnation as well. You got all of the various domains with that. I'm impressed with that. Fred, thanks for being here.
Thanks for coming to Michigan and joining us for this wonderful conference. We're really proud of the scene, the community we have here. We got 3 days of camaraderie coming up, and we'll have a great time. So thanks for supporting the cause.
Of course, it's a great beer state, and you can read more about it always in the pages, or now and again, I guess I should say, in the pages of Craft Beer and Brewing magazine, online at beerandbrewing.com. If you have questions for me, comments, what we can do better, guests you'd like to hear, or other thoughts, letters you'd like read on the air, you can reach me, John Holl, at John Holl, JOHNHOLL, at beerandbrewing.com, or on Twitter at John_Holl, again, HOLL. And we will be back next week with a brand new episode. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to y'all soon. Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.